Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Workers' Comp Fraud, what to look for, what to do, and how to protect your company. I'm Vinny Civitello, Communications Manager for the New Jersey Business and Industry Association. With us today are NJM's SIU Administrator, John Carusi, and SIU Senior Investigator, Kelly Larkin. A few housekeeping matters before we get started. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with the PowerPoint for today's presentation, so be on the lookout for those. I'd also like to draw your attention to the questions tab. John and Kelly would be happy to take all of your questions, so don't hesitate to write them in as they come to you, and I can't stress that enough. Be sure to type them in as they come to you, or you might forget by the time we come to the Q&A what you wanted to know. So now let's get things started. Kelly?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kelly Larkin. I am employed with NJM as a Senior Special Investigator in the Special Investigations Unit, also known as the SIU, and have been employed for 25 years. 23 years have been in the SIU, primarily investigating workers' compensation claim fraud and workers' compensation premium fraud. Prior to coming to NJM, I was employed as an investigator with the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection.
Good morning. My name is John Carusi. I'm an SIU Administrator at New Jersey Manufacturers Special Investigations Unit. I've got 27 years experience at NJM, 25 of which are involved in the SIU in various levels. Insurance fraud has been around a long time. So is telling a lie or making up a story for monetary gain. In preparing for today's presentation, I did some quick research to see if I could find the first account of insurance fraud. I found a story dating back all the way back from 360 BC about an ancient merchant named Hegestratos. This early fraudster Hegestratos attempted a staged loss after he took out an insurance policy on his ship and its cargo. He planned to sell his cargo, which was corn, to a third party and then sink the ship, but keep the loan. This scam backfired when his crew learned of the plot. So they chased him off the ship and drowned poor Hegestratos. In the 1960s, NJM and other carriers began to use investigators and insurance to fight fraud. And this was the beginning of the Special Investigations Unit, or SIU. Today's fast-paced news world is filled with stories about insurance fraud, including workers' compensation fraud. The most common workers' compensation fraud arises out of two areas. Workers' compensation fraud can be defined as when someone knowingly makes a false representation of a material fact to obtain or deny workers' compensation benefits or to avoid responsibility under the law. Another type of workers' compensation fraud is when an employer misrepresents the amount of payroll or classification of its employees. What makes a false statement material? Just because it is a lie doesn't make it fraud. To constitute fraud, a lie, act, or omission must be material. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's a legal term. A misstatement is material if at the time it was made, a reasonable insurer would have considered the represented fact as relevant to its concerns, and the represented fact must also be important in determining liability. This is a New Jersey Supreme Court case, Longobardi versus Chubb. Let's look at some statistics about injuries in the workplace. In 2015, there were 2.9 million non-fatal injuries that occurred in the U.S. That's down 48,000 injuries than in 2014. And that's about a rate of 3 cases per 100 full-time workers. Let's talk a little bit about some examples of workers' comp fraud. As discussed a few slides ago, there are major areas workers' compensation fraud occurs. First area is when the worker commits fraud. A worker can commit workers' comp fraud when he misrepresents the job status while collecting benefits, files a claim for an injury that did not occur on the job, misrepresents the physical condition to obtain workers' comp benefits, or misrepresents a previous trauma or treatment. Other examples of workers' comp fraud can take place at the employer level. An employer can commit workers' comp fraud by misrepresenting the amount of payroll or the classification of its employees. An employer must also always have workers' comp, and if they do not have workers' comp coverage or fail to have it, it could also be a major problem. Let's talk a little bit about insurance strategies for insurance companies. Your workers' comp carrier should put together a game plan to fight fraud, and here's a few strategies. Strong SIU leadership means a willingness to be accountable to both internal and external customers. It's a commitment to protect policyholder assets. Insurance companies must understand the importance and be accountable to both the internal and external customers. Insurance companies must understand the importance of saving and mitigating claim payouts, because doing so impacts future premiums paid by the policyholders. Communication is key in partnering with policyholders. Carriers must work closely with their policyholders to take claims of suspicious activity seriously. The claims department adjuster is usually the point person between the SIU and policyholders. SIU coordinates its claim efforts with claims, including the legal department, to maximize efficiency and effectiveness. Insurance companies' strategies should include a willingness by the carrier to spend time and money to fight fraud, and to execute a fraud plan. And they must also continue to constantly adapt to new fraud schemes. We do this through training adjusters and underwriters on how to identify fraud indicators. We use technology such as digital evidence, special cameras, database, and internet research to detect and document insurance fraud. Above all else, the SIU must perform fair, thorough, and efficient investigations. Before I throw it over to Kelly to talk a little more about strategies for policyholders, please remember that questions can be submitted and will be discussed at the end of this presentation. I'm going to ask Kelly to talk about anti-fraud strategies for policyholders and some specific steps in NJM's anti-fraud approach.
Thank you, John. NJM maintains a strong working relationship with its policyholders. During the claim process, we ask that our insureds follow close internal procedures for reporting work-related injuries in a timely manner. NJM asks that our policyholders work closely with us to monitor the claim process for a swift recovery and return to the workplace. We ask that any concerns or suspicions be communicated to the claims representative immediately. Policyholders who keep their eyes and ears open for any information that may assist in handling or investigating a claim are our greatest resource for detecting fraud. For example, perhaps the injury was captured on company security cameras. It is requested that employers maintain up-to-date information on their employees by having current photos and up-to-date addresses. Finally, we request that policyholders understand how the workers' compensation process works and help manage their expectations by understanding that cost containment and mitigating savings are often the best outcome. There are several red flags or indicators that a claim may be fraudulent or suspicious. We ask that our insureds look at many factors, such as the timing of the injury. Perhaps an injury is reported first thing Monday morning or on a Friday afternoon, prior to a layoff, strike or plant closing, and/or pending termination of employment. When a claim is ambiguous or cannot be substantiated by any evidence, such as any eyewitnesses, or the details of the injury are vague and cannot be recalled, or if the injury is not timely reported. Another red flag is when the reported claim and the nature and extent of the injury do not align, especially when the alleged injury is unusual for the line of work the claimant usually performs. For example, a red flag will be raised if a secretary reported being injured on a forklift or falling off a roof. Red flags occur when the employee's complaints cannot be substantiated. Other fraud indicators arise when an injured worker tries to extend their time out of work by malingering in their treatment and delaying their time out of work. This happens when an employee will not comply with the treatment regimen, thereby prolonging their disability period. Another red flag arises when the employee is found working another job while collecting temporary disability. This may or may not be fraud, since this scenario is usually evaluated on a case-by-case basis. The outcome will depend on several factors and materiality, which we discussed earlier. That will be important. Regardless of the outcome, this scenario must still be investigated. Another fraud indicator occurs when there is credible information and evidence that the employee is more active than he's claiming to his employer and/or his treating doctor. For example, an employee may be found playing soccer or football over the weekend or moving heavy furniture while claiming disability at the same time. NJM takes on a team approach when it comes to fighting fraud. The Special Investigative Unit SIU team is led by a former New Jersey Deputy Attorney General. NJM's SIU is made up of former law enforcement officers and expert insurance fraud investigators. In recent years, the team has formed an analytical team that works closely with the investigators to provide them with the tools they need to hit the ground running upon assignment of a case. The analytical team is being enhanced daily. NJM's SIU also has an extensive vendor network that is utilized for surveillance and other investigative needs. This allows for the flexibility needed to fight fraud 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. NJM's anti-fraud approach is multi-pronged. We operate with transparency among all parties that handle your workers' compensation claims. The SIU investigators can view recent notes and documents regarding medical treatment of a claimant, legal case status, and policyholder communication. This helps the SIU investigator understand medical or other restrictions and review in real time updated information regarding the subject's physical description, his address, and his claim status. For example, whether or not the subject has returned to work. The SIU provides direct updates to referring parties and NJM's attorneys in real time so that claim decisions are appropriate. NJM's SIU has a case management system which exclusively is dedicated to SIU work. The SIU's secured digital evidence folder contains videos, photos, reports, and audio recordings that can be used in court in defense of a claim. NJM's SIU investigators are required to complete investigative reports summarizing the findings or outcome of the investigation. These written reports include the evidence obtained in an investigation or lack thereof of fraud. They document any reasonable suspicion of fraud. Finally, when there is a reasonable suspicion of fraud, the SIU makes a referral to law enforcement, which is a legal requirement. Many workers' compensation cases proceed to workers' compensation court for possible settlement. The SIU's investigation results are often used to mitigate the settlements that an injured worker seeks by showing videotape of the injured workers performing activities that are inconsistent with their claimed disability. The SIU evidence also has helped terminate benefits of an injured worker who may be malingering in treatment. And at times, an investigator's testimony may be required to assist in the defense of a claim. Aside from workers' compensation court, if fraud is suspected or found, the SIU is required by law to report our findings. The case will be referred to the Office of the Insurance Fraud Prosecutor, also known as the OIFP, where they will screen cases for assignment. If an assignment is made, and if the proofs are strong and the dollar amount of the suspected fraud is significant, it can be handled as a criminal matter at the OIFP. However, the majority of the assignments are deemed civil in nature. Those cases are transferred to the Bureau of Fraud Deterrence, also known as the BFD, which is a part of the New Jersey Banking and Insurance. Both agencies are funded by New Jersey insurance carriers. NJM has a comprehensive internal anti-fraud approach to help members from multiple departments understand the complexity of workers' compensation fraud. We conduct an annual advisory meeting of all NJM's lines of business. We discuss major initiatives, case studies, and recommendations. Our most recent SIU roundtable was held on May 12, 2017. It included representatives from the Workers' Comp Claims Department, Legal Department, Medical Services, Sales, Underwriting, and of course the SIU. The purpose of this seminar is to educate all staff on SIU news, to discuss trends, and to review workers' compensation specific initiatives by the SIU. There's also a workers' compensation premium fraud group that meets monthly to discuss coordination of all areas relating to detection, investigation, and prevention of workers' compensation premium fraud. Finally, we conduct outreach meetings among the SIU staff and departmental staff to gain buy-in from department heads. I'm going to ask John to discuss the importance of deterrence.
Deterrence is the most effective and least expensive way to fight fraud before it happens. Providing examples, both serious and entertaining, can help change public perception. The Office of the Insurance Fraud Prosecutor in New Jersey has taken a sobering view of penalties associated when one commits fraud, as well as the impact insurance cheats have on honest folks. On the screen are two examples of some public awareness campaigns provided by the Office of the Insurance Fraud Prosecutor. The Coalition Against Insurance Fraud is the nation's only anti-fraud watchdog that speaks for consumers, insurance companies, legislators, regulators, and others. They focus on enacting tough new anti-fraud laws and regulations. They educate the public on how to fight back, and they conduct objective and useful research on fraud, and also bring people together and organizations to work on specific areas of insurance fraud. Organizations like the Coalition, the National Insurance Crime Bureau, or NICB, as well as law enforcement agencies, send press releases like the ones you saw earlier to show the impact and punishment for those who commit insurance fraud. You've probably heard some of the Coalition's service pieces on either radio or TV. Some ads portray people contemplating all types of insurance fraud in various situations. For example, these public service spots can show the impact of a criminal fraud conviction could have on future employment. They show the embarrassment one feels when he or she is a known insurance offender. insurance fraud offender, and how people can be persuaded by others to lie to their insurance carrier. These ads can influence people to make the right choice and step away from a potential life-changing decision to commit fraud. There's also deterrence that can take place in your workplace. As always, clear communication can help curb insurance fraud and prevent unnecessary expenses. Putting internal procedures together to help reduce fraud and implementing a safety program should be adopted. Reminding employees that fraud is a crime and having a fraud hotline available to report suspicions to your carrier can also be a piece of your company's fraud-fighting toolbox. NJM offers posters and other materials that can be used to deter fraud in your workplace. Now I'm going to send it back to Vinny to see if there's any questions.
Thanks, John. Looks like we have a couple questions already, but I want to give everyone else a moment to type in anything they have. So while I'm doing that, I'd like to take a second to remind you about the Handouts tab. I used to get a lot of questions from people about how to download the PowerPoint slides, but ever since I started stalling time explaining this, that's gone down. So just open up the tab marked Handouts and the file is right there. You can also just wait until tomorrow and they'll be emailed to you with the video of the recording from today's webinar. There's also the Questions tab right below it. If you have a question, type it in right there and I'll make sure our guests answer it. And don't be shy. You're going to get a survey after this is over asking how you liked the webinar. And whenever someone says something like, oh, I wish they touched on X, I always ask myself, why didn't they just ask the question? You've got a room full of experts here, so take advantage of it. In fact, NJM's Director of Workers' Compensation of the Workers' Compensation Legal Department, Ann DeBellis, has just joined us to help with the Q&A. So you even have one more expert now than when we started. So with all that out of the way, let's jump right into our first question that comes from Maureen, who would like to know, if I suspect a workers' compensation fraud, can I report it anonymously?
Yes, you can. Providing your name is not a requirement to report fraud to your employer or your carrier. Providing credible evidence is the most important thing. Your insurance carrier should independently try to corroborate any information you should provide. The Office of the Insurance Fraud Prosecutor has a website and a hotline for folks to also notify them about suspected fraud. The OIFP has a website and that call-in number is 1-877-55-FRAUD, 877-55-FRAUD, and the website is www.nj.gov/OAG insurance fraud. And again, a lot of good information can be provided on the OIFP's website.
Okay, Richard asks, what are the rules regarding dismissal of a substandard employee after returning to work after a 5-month disability leave?
Hi, Vinny. This is Ann DeBellis. You're asking a question that doesn't sound like it's directly fraud-related and it's more employment-related. So would you read me back the question again, Vinny?
Sure. So Richard asks, what are the rules regarding dismissal of a substandard employee after returning to work after a 5-month disability leave? So I guess let's just say the leave was legitimate for 5 months, let's say, but the worker, you were probably going to fire them anyway, and then it was like, well, you know, now it looks like I'm doing it after the leave. So what are the rules?
Well, first thing you should know is that the NJBIA has a special hotline where you can ask employment law experts questions from Jackson Lewis attorneys who are experts in employment law. This is not directly my area of expertise, but I do have some comments or thoughts to share. Primarily one being is a company really leaves itself vulnerable when it takes a legitimate employment action in and around a non-work-related or even a work-related period of disability. You leave yourself vulnerable to a charge that you did a wrong employment action in retaliation for an employee taking a legitimate leave for disability. So I would caution you to talk to your employment law experts or reach out to the BIA's experts for a consultation. But in terms of discharging employees who are employees at will can be discharged for any reason or no reason, but just not a wrongful or illegal reason. So as long as you're well documented in terms of the substandard, you've laid out your expectations, you've corrected them, and they're not able to meet your expectations, as long as you have that documentation in place and the timing is not suspicious, you should be okay. But again, I really want to caution you to reach out to your employment law experts or the folks at the BIA to give you some more guidance on a specific issue.
Cool. Neil asks, what can be done in cases where an employee keeps telling the doctor that he or she is not improving and the doctor prescribes out of work, and the timeout appears to be disproportionate to the injury or illness sustained?
Well, as a policyholder, if your company has an SIU department, you can reach out to the claims representative. I know that that's what happens here at NJM, and they will express their concerns to the claims representative, who in turn can make a referral to the SIU department to possibly conduct surveillance of the individual to document his actual disability and his complaints.
And Vinny, if I can just add on to that, I know our claims adjusters are really expert at looking at specific types of injuries and looking at especially the official disability guidelines and determining what is the average or what is the appropriate amount of time for this person to be out of work. The claims adjusters can reach out to the doctors, have a communication, and if they suspect fraud, we're the first kinds to make those referrals to make sure that that employee is really recuperating correctly or is not committing fraud.
Connie asks, do you investigate all claims or just ones that sound suspicious?
Well, the claims department are really the first line of investigation. So in that sense, all claims are investigated, determine if it's compensable, what happened, the injuries, the circumstances, the medical treatment. So for that part of your question, yes, every claim is investigated. Not every claim is investigated by the SIU, however. In fact, we're very cautious to make sure that before we take an investigation on, that we have specific fraud indicators. We mentioned during the presentation a little bit about the training that the SIU performs to the claims adjusters, including workers' comp adjusters. And we identify red flags or fraud indicators that must be notified and identified on a referral form. So when an adjuster reviews some of those red flags we spoke about earlier and has identified a few, they must articulate their suspicions before an SIU would take the case.
Okay, just a reminder, everybody, we have a few questions left here, but keep them coming. You know, we don't want to cut it off too early if we don't have to. So Josh asks, which type of case is most common, claim fraud or premium fraud?
Well, at NJM, we get a larger amount of claim fraud. So that's the typical scenarios that we talked about earlier about malingering or indications that they're working elsewhere or possibly employed at a different company while claiming they can't do the same work for the NJM policyholder. So in that respect, that's basically the answer to that question. We do see premium fraud in a smaller amount of referrals. Oftentimes, however, the premium fraud, the dollar amount, is much higher than your typical claimant fraud.
Great. Monique asks, what happens when an employee is injured and yet has another job and wants to work the other job? The injury sustained does not stop the employee from doing the second job.
Vinny, we look at those cases on a case-by-case basis. The law does acknowledge that someone can still work and collect temporary disability benefits, which I think is what the caller is getting to. Fraud would come about, however, when the person doesn't disclose that they're able to work or are in fact working the second job. So if they lose time from work for their primary job, let's say it's a construction job, they're entitled to be paid temporary disability benefits, but they may have a second job as a receptionist on the weekend where there's no physical effort involved, for example, and her doctor says that the claimant can in fact work that second job. As long as they disclose that to the doctor or to the carrier, that's not fraud. The fraud occurs where they don't disclose it, or they willfully hide it, or they embellish their symptoms, and that's where claimants can get into trouble with fraud.
All right, Gina asks, if an employee is hurt on the job and needs physical therapy and they go on work hours, does the employer have the right to tell them they need to go after work, or can that make the employer liable? Can the employer have the employee use PTO or vacation time?
And again, I'm not aware of any cases directly on point. However, if it's a work-related injury, the employer and or the carrier for the employer are liable to provide the reasonable and medically necessary care for that injury. It would be, I believe, a violation of the laws against discrimination for the employer to require the employee to use personal time to receive medical care for their work-related injury. But again, because this is an employment law question, as I said earlier, these are the kind of questions that you should be reviewing with your employment law expert. There is a convergence between workers' compensation law and employment law, and it's best to get the experts in the room together and really examine the specific factual scenario that you're speaking of.
Okay, Ingrid has one here. If an employee has been out on disability, how do we go about getting the employee to pay their portion of medical insurance? Or is the company responsible for the whole premium?
The company is not responsible for the whole premium. The employee remains responsible pursuant to whatever employment agreement there was with the employee, and you can force the employee to follow the company rules. There's nothing wrong, however, with making an accommodation. If you have a valued employee, making an accommodation, whether it's by a loan or by contributing to that premium while they're out, usually would be leading to a better outcome for the employee and a better employment situation, as well as a better workers' compensation outcome. Employers who consistently demonstrate that their valued employees are in fact valued employees generally experience less litigation. They get their employees back to work, and we know that they're controlling their costs much better than the employer who looks at every claimant as a potential fraud.
Sounds reasonable. Here's one from Carol. Does New Jersey require anti-training for insurance companies? Or anti-fraud training, sorry, I missed a word there.
Kelly here. Yes, according to newly hired claims processors, adjusters, and underwriters must obtain 4.5 hours of anti-fraud training within the first 180 days of their employment. After this initial training, the claims processors, adjusters, and underwriters then must obtain 2 hours annually. Members of the SIU are required to obtain 9 hours of anti-fraud training annually.
Second question from Connie. What if you hear something third party as an employer? So maybe I guess like one of the other employees or something tells you, you know, do you have a right to follow up on that, I guess?
Sure, that goes to our slide about keeping your eyes and ears open. Some of our best referrals and most successful cases come from the good working relationship NJM has with its policyholders. Again, the important part of this is to obtain credible information. So oftentimes the information may not lead to insurance fraud. We've had situations where people claim, for instance, they have a second job, but as Ann described, if that job is much less stressful and a much easier job, that may not be fraud. The important part is to communicate with your insurance carrier and let the experts vet whether or not there's information out there. Oftentimes, a lot of the information we get will lead to further investigation, including maybe possibly surveillance. So any information available, such as the secondary job they may be working, or any details about the suspected fraud, it's important to get that information and work directly with your claims adjuster. The claims adjuster then have the responsibility to review it with the SIU and make the appropriate referral if needed.
Okay, here's another one from Connie. It sounds like a follow-up to Monique's earlier question. If a person works, let's say that second job, making money elsewhere, will this affect what they are getting from workers' comp for income?
No, it won't. So the employee who's injured, for example, on the full-time job is going to be paid temporary disability benefits at 70% of wages, subject to statutory maximums and minimums. If the employee is also unable to work the part-time job, however, the full-time employer has no obligation to make up that part-time wage loss. If it doesn't, please send a follow-up.
Sure. So another one from Ingrid. Who is responsible for determining true disability due to an accident when a witness disputes the employee's statement of what happened?
So it sounds like there's two parts to your question. One is related to disability, and the first, or the primary part, really relates to compensability, because you say the witness disputes what happens. So if we have a claimant who reports an injury and the employer or the witness does not believe that, for example, there was an injury as a result of the accident, or that the injury was as severe as the claimant states it was, the employer or their carrier is going to obtain a medical evaluation and will rely upon the opinion of the physician who examines the claimant to determine what, if anything, occurred as a result of the accident and the liability for any treatment going forward. If the claimant disputes that, he or she can hire an attorney. It'll unfortunately go into litigation, and ultimately a judge of workers' compensation is going to decide compensability, that is, did they sustain an injury that arose out of in the course of an accident? Was it a pre-existing condition, for example? Is the mechanism of injury not likely to produce this complaint? As to the question of disability, if we're talking about disability following the termination of medical care, the insurance company for the employer can make its own independent judgment of whether or not the injury has resulted in a permanent or permanent partial or permanent total disability, and it can voluntarily make payments of disability benefits. Or if the case goes into litigation, there could be a negotiated settlement of that issue. If it can't be settled, again, ultimately a judge of workers' compensation will make the decision as to the extent of the disability and the nature of it.
Okay, I've got one more here from Lou, but if people want to get anything else slipped in while we're answering this, that's totally fine. So Lou asks, what type of training is offered by insurance companies? Now I'm guessing he means like to the company for the sake of preventing fraud, but if I'm wrong, Lou, hey, let me know. John.
Okay, that sounds a little bit like a follow-up question to the earlier question about the required training. That's that 4.5 hours for new employees, claims adjusters and underwriters. So at NJM, we tried to have a wide variety of training opportunities for our staff. Training could be live training with SIU staff or guest speakers. Perhaps an attorney could come in and discuss some of the questions we've even been talking about today. We also go over red flags, fraud indicators, and new schemes and trends that we see out in the world of insurance fraud. NJM also likes to do ride-alongs. So for someone who's an inside adjuster, for example, and would like to see what it's like a day in the life of an SIU investigator, we also provide that. It's a great opportunity not only for the adjusters to learn what it is to be an SIU investigator, but it's a great way for the investigators to understand what the adjusters are up against, whether it's an auto adjuster, a workers' comp adjuster, or a homeowner's adjuster. We also work with NICB. NICB, we mentioned earlier, that's the National Insurance Crime Bureau. And they have something called the National Insurance Crime Training Academy, or NICTA. And this is an online presentation that has over 80 courses on all types of insurance fraud. The beauty of this product is everyone can satisfy their anti-fraud training at their desk and also make sure they work enough of their regular files and also keep up with their required anti-fraud training.
Okay, well that's about all the questions we have, so I think it's as good a time as any to bring this to a close. Don't forget, all of you will be receiving a recording of today's webinar and the PowerPoint slides via email. Lastly, when you close out of the webinar, a survey will come up on the screen that we hope you'll fill out so we can understand how to best provide you important information in a webinar format. Our next webinar, Choosing a Retirement Plan for Your Business, will take place Wednesday, June 21st, and will present the advantages and differences between profit-sharing plans, money purchase pension plans, 401k, and individual plans. So until next time, for John Carusi, Kelly Larkin, and Ann DeBellis, this is Vinny Civitello thanking you for being with us this morning and wishing you a good day.